What's up, everybody? Welcome to the weightlifting whiteboard. Today we're going to talk about the consequences of anterior pelvic tilt and how this can negatively affect the bottom position of your snatch, clean, and squat. I hear people talk all the time about how they feel like they can't hit a good bottom position because their hip flexors are too tight and they're having some pain in the front of their hips when they hit that very bottom position. If we zoom in on this pelvis here, I drew in the psoas and iliacus, two of our primary hip flexor muscles. So that psoas runs from the spine down to the lesser trochanter, just kind of the inside and back of our thigh bone, whereas the iliacus runs from the inside of the pelvic bowl down to that same spot on the femur. Sorry for the earthquake here, changing hands. If we think about bringing the femur up towards our chest, like bringing our knees to our chest or going into the bottom of a squat, you can see how those two muscles would actually shorten and not lengthen as we move into that position. So if you're having any pain in the bottom of a squat, it's not from a stretch on those two muscles, it's probably caused by hip impingement, something we're going to talk about more here in a minute. So an anteriorly tilted pelvis, if you kind of compare the position of these two pelvis or pelvi, I don't know what the correct plural term is, you can see that that pelvis is just kind of dumped forward. Most people think of hip flexion of just bringing that knee up towards the chest, but we could actually cause a little bit of hip flexion by anteriorly tilting our pelvis. If we've already used up a little bit of our hip flexion by dumping that pelvis forward, then it's reasonable to expect that we would not hit as low of a bottom position in the snatch or clean or any of those deep squatting movements, because we already used up some of that hip flexion range of motion. We don't have that full range available. Another consequence of anterior pelvic tilt is that it changes the orientation of our hip sockets. So these two middle diagrams here are pictures of our pelvis, like if we were looking down at the urinal, kind of looking from the top down at our hip bones. So these green half circles here are the hip sockets. You can see how the hip socket is kind of pointing towards the front of our body, whereas these red hip sockets are pointing more towards the side. So what this change in orientation does is it causes a change in the amount of coverage of the front of the femoral head. So here you can see that that hip socket is out of the way of the front of the femoral head, which gives an individual adequate internal rotation as well as hip flexion. This is in contrast to what they call acetabular retroversion, which is just that hip socket pointing more towards the side and back of the body than you would normally expect, which causes more coverage of the front of that femoral head. So you could imagine internal rotation being limited, the femoral neck running into the edge of that hip socket a little sooner than you might expect. And that change in pelvis position could also negatively affect hip flexion, causing those two bones to run together as well. So what are a couple consequences of hip impingement? Well, you can develop what's called cam and pincer lesions. So in response to kind of this repetitive damage to either the hip socket or femoral neck, the body lays down more bone in these two areas. If we're laying down more bone on the femoral neck, which is represented in red here, it's called the cam lesion. If we're laying down more bone on the hip socket, it's what we call a pincer lesion. Laying down more bone in either one of these areas is actually going to increase the likelihood of hip impingement. Why is hip impingement a bad thing? If those two bones continuously ram into one another, it causes that femoral head to kind of bounce around the inside of the hip socket like a pinball in a pinball machine. If that femoral head isn't tracking nice and smoothly and kind of banging around, you could imagine how the hip socket could wear out a little bit more quickly than we would like. So this could cause things like osteoarthritis or maybe a hip labral tear. So people with anteriorly tilted pelvises, or pelvi, I don't know again, typically try to compensate for this anteriorly tilted position by assuming a wide squat stance with their toes pointed out. This is termed a compensation and not a solution because this could actually make your problems a little bit worse over the long term. So if we zoom back in on this pelvis and hip socket here, if we think about the back of our joint capsule here becoming tight, so kind of squeezing it together back here, it would cause that femoral head to be pushed towards the front of the hip socket where our problem already is. So with that chronic posterior capsule tightness, we could actually cause the femoral head to wear out the front of that hip socket a little bit sooner than we would like. So that's a little overview of hip impingement and why it's a bad thing. In the next episode, we will talk about how to identify hip impingement and anterior pelvic tilt on an athlete, and then also talk about some ways to correct this anterior pelvic tilt so you can hit a nice solid bottom position without beating up those hip joints. Thanks for listening. Lift heavy, lift often.